years old when death came knocking at her mother's door. And she knew what it was because in this small town, there was always what they call the rites of death. They belonged to a nice church that had their traditions and rituals. And those things were to never be broken. But when her mama called her to her bed, she said, "Daughter, I want you to listen to what I have to say to you." Now, I know that is custom and tradition for the church to give us this rites of passage, but I want to go a different way. You see, I don't want them to remove the pillow from under my head before my last breath comes. And I don't want them to shroud the clock when my time to pass. And please don't put sheets on the window. I want to know that death is not a gloomy time. And don't dare let them shroud the mirror, because I want my soul to live. You see, those were the custom and tradition of the small church and this small town. And her mother knew it, but it wasn't for her. But that was a big burden for this 9-year-old child. You see, her father was a preacher in that small church, in that small town, and he knew about customs and tradition. So as she sat, sitting on a swing that her mother made for her under that cranberry tree in the backyard, she knew death had come calling. She watched the women, all dressed in white, marching in unison to her mother's room. And she watched them as they, one by one, marched through the front door to the small room where her mother lay. And when they got there, they did the rites of death, as was custom and tradition in this small church in this small town. As soon as they saw her mother struggle, one of them reached in to remove the pillow from her mother's head. The little girl said, "No, my mama don't want death to come easy. She was always a fighting woman and she wants to go out that way." But because it was custom and tradition, they removed the pillow. And as her mother lay there, gasping for breath, she could not talk, her eyes said everything. And the little girl watched as they took the sheet and put it over the window. And she said, "No, my mama said death is not a gloomy time. It's joyous. Let the sun shine." But because it was custom and tradition, they pinned the sheet to the window and the room got dark. And then she watched as her mother grasped for her last breath and she could not talk, but her eyes said it all. They took a black cloth and they put it over the clock. The little girl said, "No, my mama wants to know that time hasn't stopped because I'm no longer here. Don't shroud the clock." But she had no impact because it was what? Custom and tradition of the small church in this small town. And then she watched as they put the covering over the mirror. And she cried and said, "No, my mama won't be here, but she wants her soul and spirit to linger on. Don't take it away." But they ignored her because it was custom and tradition in the small church in the small town. And as she watched her mother, they went to the bed as was their custom and tradition, and they lifted in unison and turned her feet toward the west. And she knew at that time that her mother had transitioned into a better world. And she watched as the last woman, as the rite required, closed her mother's eyes. And the last thing she saw was, "Speak for me. Someone speak for me." And she watched as they washed her feet and shroud the body and put her to the living room for visitors to come, as was the custom of that small church in that small town. And as her mother lay there with her eyes their eyes were watching God. And for that book, she began to speak for all the small people in Eatonville, Florida, and all throughout the South who had no voice, whose stories were never told. And she dedicated her life to retelling their story and giving their voice history. And because of that, she broke custom and tradition. Some things